George Floyd is murdered in Minneapolis, and all of a sudden, in the protests, people start attacking monuments. And not just Confederate monuments, I guess the ones that maybe you'd expect, but also Columbus monuments. So that was our moment. We realized that something was going on there to bring the project back into existence, but also change it, also expand it a lot, because there was this line that the protesters were drawing between Columbus, Confederates, Founding Fathers, all these other sort of symbols of the American historical narrative, the conventional narrative. So, yeah, we decided we have to look at other symbols as well to understand Columbus. And that's how Stonebreakers came into being. We basically restarted shooting from scratch.
Wow.
Traveled around the country, as you saw, throughout that summer, trying to follow the protests. Obviously, there was so much going on, we couldn't really expect to cover everything. But sort of following the news, rushing to a certain place where there was a specific monument that seemed important, that was being contested, that was being transformed, attacked by the protests in some way. And that was the first phase. The second phase, then we sort of realized we wanted to look at how Americans tell their history more broadly, in the small things too, the plaques that people don't look at, or historical tourism, the patriotic holidays, the speeches that we hear on those occasions. And then kind of, what other ideas of monuments are coming out of this incredible period in which sort of history is bursting into our present. What are people thinking, artists, activists, in terms of a different idea of monument that maybe doesn't involve, a guy up on a pedestal looking down on us. And then we went back to some of those places, did the interviews that you saw, and it was just an incredible learning process for us. We heard in the media and the news a lot about cancel culture, the cancellation, erasing history. That's what, sometimes you heard this sort of buzzword, these terms, and it just seemed like something really different to us, actually kind of the opposite, sort of like the opportunity was being given to us to look at history and histories and stories that had been erased and that were not represented in those statues. So in the actual act of contesting a monument, even physically changing it, damaging it, out of that you get this opportunity to bring into the community a conversation, even a fight if you want sometimes, about topics that weren't discussed, weren't represented in that monumental landscape.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting how you sort of like push that notion of what a memorial is, what a sculpture is. It can be a living, breathing thing. And so, Curtis, I know that for you, you believe in the power of film to tell stories and to sort of disrupt stories that we think we know about. So can you just talk a little bit about your attachment to this film and what brought you to it? Because I know as a filmmaker and a storyteller, we really see a lot of that in this film.
Yeah, Isaac and Valerio really had a solid footing in how they were reapproaching this, what began obviously, as you just mentioned, as a Columbus story and really turned into an American story, or how to really take a step back and explore, especially through the protests that are alongside the toppling of these monuments, just like really what it is to be an American, or who gets to decide who is an American and how Americans are represented, especially in this contemporary years, at this time, and in the future though. I really love how he really ended this film, because you see Franklin Roosevelt talk about 1,000 years in the future how we're represented, and there was never any thought to or actually it probably was thought now to say that
right.
That's what I'm saying. Yes,
accidentally.
Yes, exactly. There was thought into this is who America is, and it is not. And the reality is, it is up to us as artists, as storytellers, as activists, as journalists, as American citizens, or just people of the world, to really represent who we are
right.
in this culture, and that's why coming on and helping like really flesh out what this film could be was really important to me. And I'm glad we have people that were really supportive of this, you all and the audience here and so many other places. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think I do. I think it's a really important story. I think that the way that you sort of juxtapose the history with the current day issues and memorials that were going on. One thing that caught me was you have these three presidents. You've got Trump. I'm sorry if there's any Trumps people, but that voice, oof. When you open with that, it's very jarring. Yeah, I think that was intentional. And then you have Biden talking about the same thing, that we revere these statues, that they are our history, that we are Americans. And then we end with Eisenhower. Who do we end with?
So FDR.
FDR. Who Eleanor I loved. I don't know about FDR. So can you talk about that? Like, that was intentional. So because we're seeing we know three different characters of presidents, very different, but yet they're revering these statues. You're like sort of bringing us back into, this is what America stands for, from a Republican president, a Democratic president, and yeah.
You want that?
Sure. I can take it.
I can either way. It doesn't matter.
I'll just say one thing that stood out to me, at least, is how Trump, in his speech at the beginning, he sort of celebrates how during the American Revolution they tear down the statue of King George, right? And then we thought it was interesting how just one or 2 years later, when he goes to Mount Rushmore, all of a sudden, touching a statue in any way whatsoever or a monument is completely taboo,
Right.
unacceptable. Erasing history is criminal. He uses the word criminal. The Biden scene is a tricky scene. People, I think, feel different things there, and we struggled a little with whether to keep it or not. What is it? What does it mean? On one hand, like you said, hearing Trump's voice is like a gut punch, I think, especially for a lot of us after he sort of disappeared from this scene a little bit, for a couple of years, and you didn't have to hear that all the time. And then so
we did, though.
Yeah,
You
we
didn't edit when you're editing.
We definitely listened to it many times. But then you hear Biden, and on one hand, I think, at least personally, I feel there is a bit of relief there. There's a little bit of, okay, I don't have to hear that other rhetoric again. But then you start noticing the rhetoric is quite similar. And we're talking about the monuments in the same way, and we're talking about this American exceptionalism narrative. And it's a little uncomfortable. And I guess in the end, for me, it feels like kind of where we ended up with the film itself, in this ambiguous pacification of what was this incredible sort of moment of protest and of incomplete reckoning, I guess. And then we're left with some questions, and is it? And it's not resolved.
Can I add to that, though? I think part of the reason we ended up keeping the Biden scene also is just to look at the difference in who's there.
Right, that's what I was
and
going to
who's
say. You can
represented.
tell. Yeah, you can
I'm
see
sorry.
the total
Yeah,
difference.
absolutely. The tone is different, the feel is different. I mean, everything Isaac said was totally on point, but at the same time, there's people there representing what America is to them on that day of independence, right? And that's very striking compared to who was there, 2 years earlier, right? Oh, a year earlier. I'm sorry, the time gets confusing. 2 years earlier, yes. 2 years earlier, but yeah, that makes a world of difference.
Yeah,
It's all white people.
right.
Yeah.
No, it's a
Let's just
completely
call it what it
different
is.
audience. But
Yeah.
then we end with that. Thank you very much.
Yes.
So I just have one last question, as Ellen's saying. You use a lot of cinema verite in this. It's not narration. You don't have someone speaking all the time and telling us what we're seeing. I love some of the scenes, like when you had the bison, then we went to the gold mining people, and then we went to Mount Rushmore, and the music is so foreboding, but we're just sitting there watching sort of like everyday life. What was your thought process as, in shooting this film and then editing and putting it together, that you wanted sort of the characters who were people were actually the ones who were telling the story.
I want Isaac to take main point on this because he is the cinematographer, especially. But I just want to say I'm glad you recognize that because this is an untraditional documentary, and these days a lot of documentaries really have like really substantial, not substantial, that's not the word, but like they're kind of character based. Is the focus, and I'm glad you recognize there are actual characters in this because it's been a little bit of a difficult road to get people to take understand this film. So I'm glad I'm glad this audience really gets it, or I hope this audience gets it.
They all get it. They're
Okay.
like,
all right, good,
yeah,
good,
they
good,
totally
good.
get it.
And that audiences are getting it. We knew we just had to get it out there and get some real champions behind it to make that happen. So thank you for that. But
Definitely second the thank you for everyone who brought us here tonight and made this event possible. Yeah, initially our plan was actually to have no interviews either. We had started out that it was going to be entirely verite, observational. In some ways, it just reflected our process. Valeria and I are both, white guys, and in some ways outsiders, having grown up in Italy, to a lot of this stuff, and we really didn't feel like we had this kind of like overarching narration to put on these stories. So we thought first, okay, we're just going to hear voices of protest. We're just going to see what happened, look at these statues, look at how they've been transformed by people during those protests. Then as we went on, we realized, no, we need a little more context. We actually do need to hear from the people who are most directly involved and touched by the sort of the imposition of these monuments initially, and that who are now taking up arms, metaphorically, well, sometimes metaphorically,
Right,
sometimes literally.
absolutely.
And hear their reasons, and that's what we tried to do. But I think the approach was always to try to give the viewer sort of the space and time to look at some of this stuff. I mean, obviously, no documentary is neutral, no film is
Right.
neutral and truly objective, and we certainly didn't set out to do something that was neutral or objective, that sort of had or showed both sides or anything like that. But at the same time, it also wanted to demand questions and kind of like ask people to draw their own connections without us doing it too much for them. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely does, and I think that it's true to be able to sit with it for a minute and not be constantly being told what it is that you're seeing, or being able to make your own decisions. And I appreciate that. I appreciate you understanding that because you're not from here, that you're creating a film about America and letting America tell that story. I mean, I would think that people would appreciate that you sort of stepped away from it. So that was great. All right, we're going to have you all sit down. And we're going to bring up are we doing Q&A after? After, Q&A after. Thank you. Save and write down your questions, because if you're like me, you'll forget. So I want to bring up Tron, and I want to bring up Karen, and I want to bring up Liz, please, to the stage. Quick conversation too about the film and how it relates to Boston and how it relates to. I'm sorry, I didn't mean Boston. Karen's works for the city of Boston. I didn't mean to harm you or threaten you. I can sit over there. We all love Boston. What are you talking about? We're all, yeah, come on, let's go show some love for Boston. So we just wanted to get a little bit of perspective from three different types of folks who live in this space, who live in this public art space. So, Tron, I want to start with you. So artists, I think of artists as oftentimes moving us forward in the work that you do, and to create different histories and sort of like this decolonization in a way that using community and bringing community in to help tell different stories, which is what this film is about, right? Is about deconstructing, in a sense, what a history is that we all have been told and that we've all been taught. But how important is that, even in the city of Boston, because you work and live in the city of Boston as a working artist, Can you talk about that, about the importance of bringing in community to sort of help tell the stories of people that aren't on these statues, like in the Boston Common or anywhere else when you're walking around Boston?
Yes. Well, hi everyone. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so core. I mean, I think communities are what makes up, neighborhoods, residents, literally the population of really any area. And so to have their voice be at the center of that is so critical, and that hasn't always been the case throughout history. I would say it's only been in pretty like in recent, kind of modern years, and like, even thinking about the arts and cultural scene has community even been like, considered to be, a critical voice at the table. And in so many spaces, they're not even there. For me, as a community-based artist and a socially engaged artist, I've tried really to be mindful of that, having grown up in Boston and really thinking about my community and the stories that are not being told or really misrepresented. And so, especially in the arts and cultural, I think it's also political, to be real transparent. I think the decision maker, the funders, who's at the table, who gets to to showcase, who gets to, put forth or even make art. That's all such a political process, especially in the public space, in the public spheres.
And can you talk a little bit about sort of like your reflection on this film, but also some of the work that's going on in communities around Dorchester and Chinatown and new structures or sculptures that are being built to hopefully try to represent the other folks, immigrant communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the film does a really good job in, I think, bringing forth the issue and kind of presenting it and letting, and especially in recent years and everything that's culminating. I think there's some really interesting issue that it also raises. One of the things is like, I go back to kind of one of the folklorists, Joseph. He talks about, when he mentioned about the Christopher Columbus statue being a story of the elites, and we think, there's the, kind of the story that a lot of working class Italian talks about, like, giving money to fund it, but is really the prominenti. I was like really thinking about, and I wonder even has that really shifted that much in today's kind of art scene? Like who are the funders? What are the project that gets off the ground? And when I think about the art scene locally, it's very few artist-led projects, and especially community-led initiative. Oftentimes is coming from very much organization, even city level too. And so thinking about which projects get prioritized over others and how tough it is to get funding, to get support. And so I think about, projects that are happening in different neighborhoods and community, but certain, project that gets off the ground, and those that are still, trying to get realized.
Right, and I think about the types of projects too, whether it's a sculpture that's going in the Boston Common, and we'll talk about that, or whether it's a mural that's going on the side of a building, and what is that permanence, and whether that's temporary, and sort of like, who is creating that, who's it for, and how's it getting funded. So I think you're absolutely right, which is why we moved to Karen, who is the director of public art for the city of Boston. And Karen, want your reflection too on this film, but also from the lens of the city, or as the person and who runs the the space where Tron is to come to get that mural painted or that sculpture, and what is that process, and how do you see now the diversity of the city being reflected in some of the new statues that are going up and the ones that are coming down?
Sure. Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think, watching the film was really incredible, reflecting on the last 5-6 years in particular, and the experience we had here as a community. And I think one thing that isn't always visible is how long many people work to make the experience of new works happen, and also the experience of works that get taken down. So I think about here, I think our conversation was not as sharp as some of the conversations we saw there, but we certainly had protests and a lot of public dialogue here. So thinking back to 2017 when we put out the call for the Embrace, I think the next summer after Charlottesville, we did an audit of our public art collection in Boston. That's successful on our website if anyone's curious, and it was called An Opportunity for Change. I had an intern from BU in art history PhD over the summer, and I asked her to look at our collection and identify the most problematic pieces, and she picked 6 and add another 2 that she thought we should look at more closely. And I also asked her to do a survey of what was happening across the country. So when 2020 came, and after George Floyd was killed, at our joint June 9th Boston Art Commission meeting, we were on Zoom. We were still learning how to Zoom and do all these meetings for the first time. I brought that report back and reshared it with the Art Commission, which is the public body primarily made up of volunteers who makes the decisions about what art goes on city property here. And certainly, I think all the points you're making are true, but this is the process that we have. We talked about that, and we highlighted works like the Columbus, but and others that are still in conversation. But that night, Columbus was beheaded here in Christopher Columbus Park, or it may have been early the next morning. 3 days later, local artist Tory Bullock created a petition. I think he got 13,000 signatures to remove the Emancipation Group. And we were really lucky that we had been able to have sort of a scaffolded approach to these conversations that allowed us to have really incredible dialogue. And I think the folks in the Art Commission, Vice Chair Igwa Holmes, Chair Mark Pasnick, Robert Freeman, many others, put in incredible time and had really tough conversations, and many of them changed their minds because I think something really wonderful that Tory did is he directed people who were signing his petition to attend the public meeting we had and to give testimony. And so I'll say some of the commissions, they changed their minds about whether that should come down. But again, to say this is a lot of people, and I think we all have those instincts to simplify the stories, as I think we saw again and again in the documentary, and to sort of make heroes and to make saints. And I think it's very interesting, and something that I really love about the Embrace is the work Hank Willis Thomas and Mass Design Group did was that, it was trying to tell the story of a hero and also recognize the collaboration and the connections and the community and the distributed history, which is something Barry Gaither, who co-chaired that art committee, often was pointing out during our process there.
Yeah, and I think that we see that, and I think we see that change, that you don't have these statues that are just one person and on a horse, or that's telling that one story. But it seems to me that what's going up, at least what I can see from recently in Boston, are full stories, are stories like the Embrace, that are going to help tell a fuller, wider story, not just of the Kings, but of their time in Boston and as civil rights leaders. And I think that that's important, and I see that changing, and that, as Tron was saying, is about being part of community and having that community input and having people have conversations. I think that I'm going to go to Elizabeth, but I mean, I think that your office is focused on now the diversifying artwork and public art that is more reflective of the city.
Yeah, can I just say very quickly, it's also working with members of the community who've been doing this work for 10 years to see the new works that will be coming up.
Right.
So.
And one of the things is, especially in Boston, is you can go to these public meetings. You can, they want you to come to these public meetings to have these conversations. And so that brings us to Elizabeth from Embrace, because and I think that people might have thought that there wasn't all of this input that went into the creation of that public art piece, statue. It's a public art piece. And I'm just curious as to, because the Embrace is now so much more than its statue. It is now embodying what the Kings were really about, and pushing forward on civil rights and justice. And I'm curious as to the process and the thought around putting the Embrace where it is in the Boston Common, and I know how important that was. So if you can talk a little bit about that, and then also your reflections on the film.
Yeah, definitely. Just first and foremost, I just need to take like a deep breath because that the film definitely took me through an embodied experience, and so I thank you both for that. And of course, within my work in the with Embrace Boston, cannot, we are in the business of monuments, the business of symbols and culture, and so thinking about all of the work that goes into creating an object for the public, and the idea of what happens when that gets taken down. There were moments where I was like, this could happen to the Embrace, because not in the same, I guess, narrative and the way that these predominantly white men are being beheaded, or the symbols of these white men are being beheaded or torn down, or like even when they are torn down, there's like a scab there, a wound there, which I think is representative of like the wounds in which we all need to repair as a country. But yeah, that some of the things that were coming to mind, and really thinking about the fact that the Embrace is, when we were focusing so much energy through the Trump administration around hate, that this monument of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King and holding each other is very specifically about love. And so within that is the kind of embodiment of the experience of creating that piece of art, and the commission that came together and the folks that came together to not only do a juried process of artists from across the world who were able to enter designs. Of the five, four were of the five top like finalists in the jurying process. Four were Black, and they were all actually, the call was to do not figurative necessarily, somewhat more representational, conceptual, perhaps even more abstract. And so there's a lot of response to the fact that it is actually quite figurative, but definitely an abstraction of the human figure. And so we went through that process of jurying, as well as having the city. So the city, the folks across the city had the opportunity to actually vote on those five final proposals. So there were opportunities to go to your local post office. I think there was opportunities in newspapers, but plenty of access to how you can vote on these five final designs, and the city chose Hank's design, Hank Willis Thomas's design, and even so, after the unveiling, there was a strong response to its appearance, to the object itself, and quite rightfully so. Public art, as artists, we're told as creators in the studio space that you better hang your work in the space that you want to hang it in before you even have people in that space, because it's not complete until it's in that space and until folks are in that space responding to it. Mm-hmm. And so with public art, that's forever. That discourse is forever. It's so much longer than hanging something in a gallery space or in a space where it travels. But that a monument can be, has the potential to be forever. So I'm sorry. Anyways, but
no, and I
that
think
was
it's
the process.
And I think
yeah.
and I think it's important where it is. It's in the Boston Common.
Yeah.
Right. That was planned. That was chosen for a reason.
Absolutely. Do you want to speak more to that?
Yeah, I'll just say when we put the original call out, the international call, it wasn't named the location, and it was through community conversations that there was a lot of input about where it should be, which I think is what led to the development of Embrace Boston and the other investments
Yeah.
in 12 Baptist.
And I can say specifically, the Boston Common is a space. I've heard many people describe it as a place that has been historically unfriendly to folks of color, to Black folks. And the bandstand is actually the site where Martin Luther King led in 1965 a march actually from Roxbury over to the bandstand and made a specific call to Boston that this needs to be a beacon, a center, a model for what a new America could potentially be. And so that significance, that historical significance, I think the reclamation of space was another driver for sure.
Yeah.
And it's actually really exciting to be seeing how folks are activating the embrace.
And sometimes, you need that. You need people to be speaking against it and for it. You need that discourse. And so it will be, that's what art's supposed to do, right? And so I think when we're thinking about this movie and about some of the other, the juxtapositions, and I'd like to bring these folks back up. We have a question in the back.
Fantastic. I absolutely loved the film. It was so powerful. It seemed to be a lot, of course, monuments, but a lot about truth and history, and what's the truth in our history. And I was wondering if you had thought about doing another one about because where we were then, which looked like we were changing, and now many states are going back where they are not allowing history, the true history, to be taught in schools at all. And there seems to be a rise in, let's make that a definite, that you are not allowed to teach truth in history. And I didn't know what you thought, if you thought about going back and doing more, or you're like, this is done.
What do you think, Curtis? Part 2?
I mean, if there's a public demand for part 2, and y'all could help us get some funding for part 2. I mean, y'all being here is part of that support, so I'm semi-joking, but I mean, that's a thought. There's a lot of things happening in this world, and I'm sure a sequel rather, to Stonebreakers isn't necessarily out of question. It's just like, what is your point is valid. That could be a key approach, but how do we build upon that and I guess re-examine, as I said earlier, what it means to be an American after all those things that you said. Because that's a really good point you brought up. Yeah.
We'll see if we have a part 2, but you're definitely right. In some ways, those same fights that were sort of in the public square have moved into the probably the classroom, I think, and you're definitely spot on with the fact that these Republican states are now very much reinforcing, doubling down on this patriotic education narrative in ways that I would say we can say are definitely very, very disturbing to us after watching the film, even me after rewatching it again. And I don't know, I think what's important, so that's true, these red states are doing this, and we can look at that and say how terrible that is. I think sometimes we also need to look a little bit about what's happening in our blue states and our progressive cities, where in some ways what I think was, what we seemed to me we captured were some actual revolutionary moments in which public consciousness was truly shifting. In some ways, the interventions that are done in terms of historical representation and public memory, I think, can be a little limiting, and can sort of suppress what was an opportunity that was created there. And something that I talk about a lot in these Q&As is how when cities sort of disappear monuments in the middle of the night, with no comment, no announcement. Because I think sort of the public confrontation, the public discourse around what's going to happen with that monument, even just witnessing it, like you saw in New Haven when the Columbus statue was taken down, having a big group of people, the whole community witnessing it is so important. And obviously it's better, I think, for the community to not have that monument than to have it. That was the request of the protest. But I think there's sometimes a missed opportunity when you do it under the cover of silence.
I just want to say real quick though, and Sharon brought this up, and Ariel said it. In Philly, in the film, used like the ideal word is really reclamation, right? And so,
Right.
I think a really important aspect to look forward in the future, and that's whether we make it or someone else makes a sequel or inspired sequel to this, is like building on that whole reclamation aspect of things, of monuments, of statues, of it all. And reclaiming these spaces and cities and all those things, especially the artists. And the artists, as you mentioned, as you all mentioned, do need that support, of course, and probably re-examining where that support comes from, even as filmmakers as well, right? Is, I think, really key to the future. You had brought up the Trump speech in the beginning of the film, Lisa, and it's funny, he actually gives the answer, an answer, not the answer, excuse me, unintentionally. And Isaac did mention like the how he kind of took it back, how he took it back after, about when they melted down those old statues into whomever, to the English, I guess, and built bullets out of them, right? Which is funny because that is actually to give another example, that's actually what's happening to some of the Confederate statues in Virginia, in Richmond, that you saw Monument Avenue that were taken down, that we showed, that they are, not to build bullets, excuse me.
I was going to say.
But sorry.
I totally missed that news story.
No, but to melt those down and build a statue that's more representative
Of the community. In America.
Which is a story that I don't want to say got buried, but because it hasn't happened yet, meaning that we don't actually, not even sure if the melting has happened yet because we've been trying to track it, but it's been difficult. So maybe that's
We wanted to include that in the film, but that seemed like it was going to take many.
Yeah, we
years,
tried.
so.
we tried.
I was just gonna say that's part two, the melting, because the thing that I'm thinking about when you're describing that process, it's like the process of repair, right? And I mentioned that those ones that are taken down now, I can't help but think of like open wounds, evidence of wounds, and so I think that the process of repair is all of those things, right? It's like destruction first, and then development to colonize, right? So it's really interesting to think about, that material and what it once represented and how it can be reclaimed and repaired for sure.
I do want to add, I really like what Ariel in the film talked about, the curator towards the end, with kind of the messaging and the stories that, public space that leads towards freedom and accountability, and how just so much things can evolve through kind of the public consciousness too. And not only, monuments and memorial, but even buildings itself, like so much has shifted that buildings have to be renamed. For example, like the opioid crisis with the Sackler family. So many institutions have to rethink, where the money is coming from and the accountability behind that. So it's, we're talking about monument and memorial in this conversation, but there's so much more in the U.S. and as a society that we have to, really think through. And when it comes to thinking around the idea of freedom and accountability.
This gives me the opportunity, I think, to say what's really important is that we talked about what comes next. These battles are about these symbols, but what we came to learn was that they're not just symbolic. Like sometimes we get stuck in this, they're trying to police language, police imagery. It's really not that. It's just tool because these are fights that are very concrete, that are about, like you said, the actual issues about people's lives. So we hope to, exactly like you said, this to be just a tiny starting point of something broader, bigger, and especially more concrete that deals with the actual problems. You know, police brutality, land back. We talked a lot about monuments, what kind of new monuments can be built, or even going beyond renaming, stuff like that. But in talking to the folks out at Pine Ridge, I mean, for them, what they told us, it's, you know, they don't want to, you know, make their own Mount Rushmore. There is actually a very divisive and strange statue of Crazy Horse that's in that same area, sculpted into the stone. That's not the point. The point is land back, and that's what Nick says, right? It's like a very concrete battle to get political, economic autonomy in the land, history in some way, like memorializing, I guess, is to be able to have that land back and live in it, you know? So hopefully that's the kind of stuff that we can talk about more with the film, just as a small starting point.
As you can imagine, there's actually even more interviews that we have and such, or stuff that we film that we have the potential to expand on some of that educational material at some point. Yeah, so just look out for it.
But I appreciate you noticing that too, about, and maybe because it was just the way you shot and we're doing it very cinema verite, that you just sort of like wanted, but just to even have the acknowledgement of this was Letitia doing, you know, and some of that. And one more question, Keisha.
I have a two-part question. First for Isaac, I think the film overall clearly had a point of view, and yet you were so respectful of everyone you captured on film, and I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit. And then to everyone else on the panel, I'm curious if there's a new monument that you've seen to someone or to a point in history that you think sort of points the way to more creative ways to recognize history or capture history than just the man on the horse. What do you think is the next generation of that monument symbolization?
Yeah, to respond to your question, going back to what I said before, I think we were trying to be hyper aware of our sort of outsider status and not having lived on our skin the oppression of a lot of the people and activists who were fighting against those statues. So what you don't see in the film, but I hope what you kind of felt by your comment, is that there's a lot of work before filming and a lot of conversations with the folks that you saw off camera, and also conversations with a lot of activists and educators who were working around these issues, before and around, who we never filmed and never interviewed, mentors of the project, I would say, and who really ended up kind of guiding what the whole structure would be. But yeah, I mean, when filming protests, filming activists, the documentary world obviously has a long history of sort of a predatory approach of taking stories, manipulating the stories of the oppressed into something more sanitized or sensational. So I guess we just tried to avoid that as best we could.
I think to your second question about just really, I think, exciting projects that are, happening. I know I didn't mention this. Wenti, who's a local, Wenti-san, who's a local artist, he's working on, and the project is supported by the city of Chinese workers for the Chinatown area. And so this is like an ode and homage to, Chinese workers who helped really build Chinatown. Is the foundation, the grassroots of that. I myself, I'm working on the project for the coming years. Karen, I'll be talking to you and the team for the year 2025, which is the 50th anniversary of the end of the war in Vietnam and the beginning of the diaspora. And for me, is also an homage to really address the legacy of war and the impact on communities that are still felt today, the intergenerational trauma, but really towards really addressing healing, not only, to acknowledge, all the pain, but then also towards healing and thinking and really having it as an as an impact on, you know, community, and not only to, like, you know, any individual, especially any kind of military kind of related, but really what is the impact on families and communities. And so for me, and really thinking about, you know, kind of this towards the collective, and not, you know, only based on, like, you know, few stories, but how does that impact kind of communities, and to really have it be a collaborative process that's really coming from, you know, from the grassroots. And I think that's what I find like really exciting projects that are really encompassing so many kind of voices and narrative that are directly from, you know, different perspective that hasn't been acknowledged. Just one quick actually plug, when we talk about kind of the border wall, there's actually a lot of really amazing art that's being done at the border right now. One of which is like one visual one that I'm thinking of is actually of a seesaw that's connecting from both on the Mexico side and on the American side, to think about like even, you know, the play for children that are involved and that are affected. So even thinking about, you know, activation of sites and thinking about how does that kind of cross. So I'm really drawn to projects that really kind of really activate that. Yeah.
To talk more, I guess, and also a plug. I think, Lisa, you described it, and the film represents it very well, that anything can really be a monument. Street names, buildings, plaques, birthdays, anniversaries. And so one of the things that we're steeped in preparation right now is the Embrace Ideas Festival, which is actually, when people think about Embrace, they think about the monument being our first monument, but truly this festival is a monument to Juneteenth, and it's deeply rooted specifically in ideas, but mostly in joy and community coming together, and with the aspiration to serve as a model for how all folks can come together to celebrate a holiday that seems that it's only for one group of people, but in reality it is the history of America. And so that's one way that we really think about what a monument can be in the future, right? A model of celebration, a coming together, an experience of joy, because there's grief and mourning definitely to be done, and within that there is still sorrow and joy existing in the same space and time as well.
In terms of exciting projects coming up to help us rethink about it, I mean, there are a ton, like I said, that have been in the works. You know, When He Sends project has been developing, and he's done a lot of engagement. We have a Frederick Douglass Legacy project happening in Lower Roxbury after a drawing by Paul Goodnight that also doesn't just picture Frederick Douglass, but also a suffragist and, you know, his son who was in the 54th and himself as a child learning to read. But we also have basketball courts and a mural going up at Malcolm X Park in Roxbury, which is really exciting and a little bit less traditional. But I'm really excited about, I've mentioned to some folks that we've stopped using the word permanent and we've tried to start saying long-term. I'm really interested in changing our concept around these pieces and having projects that are multifaceted. When we did the mural to Rita Hester in Alston, a trans woman who was murdered 20 years ago in Alston, and the murder was never explained. You know, we were interested in sort of like the Embrace model in making investments in the community and doing more. And I think like recognizing other projects like Cedric Douglass's People's Monument, when Columbus came down, when he put a blank figure that he projected light onto to show local heroes. I thought that was really beautiful. He mentioned wanting to do it at the site of the Emancipation Group. We have a lot of work to do in those conversations, and I'm hoping that we get to do it in collaboration. Exploring some of these questions through public art, through short-term installations of public art, and really continuing also exploring the concept of unmonuments, or what does it mean to have, a medicine fire in like, in a park, or to have an event that really honors the space without making a thing, and taking the space to remember without having to try to, freeze a false story in space.
I just have, oops, sorry, two different types of monuments. One pretty abstract one in Brooklyn, New York, to Shirley Chisholm, that's supposed to be in Prospect Park. That was supposed to be up already, but is not. But it looks really cool. The concept of it looks really cool, and very, very much looking forward to that. If you're not familiar, Shirley Chisholm was a congresswoman in New York, in Brooklyn, represented Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant to be specific, and the first woman to run for president in the United States in the early 70s. And I'm also excited, just because I know some people there especially, I'm excited for the Marvin Hagler. It's a very traditional one, but the Marvin Hagler statue is supposed to be going up in Brockton, Massachusetts.
That's right.
Yeah, so I'm excited about that. He's a son of local hero and son of Brockton, so very much looking forward to that, even though that is a very traditional one, most likely, but still.
It'll rival Rocky.
Oh, absolutely, for sure.
Well, thank you all so much for your time and your thoughts and your film. It was incredible and a great conversation, and I look forward to all of the new things that are happening in Boston and beyond, and for the work for the artists that are really bringing forward some incredible work and histories that all of us need to know. We're excited at Rox Film to be opening with the Embrace documentary, which is basically the storytelling about the making of Embrace and having a great conversation about that and about art and about public art. So that's exciting for us. So thank you all for coming.